Then welcome everyone to another session of our lecture series. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm Feli and also part of the organizing committee and the initiative who brought this lecture series into being. And well, there's a handout. You got that. It's also online. A few organizational matters beforehand. There's again a workshop tomorrow with Mirjam from 12 to 2 p.m. here in Dorotheenstraße 24. It's on the first chapter of Down Girl by Kate Mann on the term misogyny. The paper is online on, in Moodle, so you can access that there. Does anybody not have access to Moodle yet? Do you? Okay, if you still need to have access to that, you can come to me later. It's in Dorotheenstraße 24, room 1307, so in the right house in the on the third floor. Once again, you're all very welcome to join us afterwards tonight at Südblock. Tonight, Lou is the one who will be the person to guide you there. If you don't know where it is, it's at Südblock at Cottbusser Tor here in Berlin. And one other tip, this weekend there's the Emancipation Conference, which is organized by parts of the Department of Philosophy, as well as the Technical University and some other people. And it's free to go and you don't have to register, and there's some very interesting speakers coming, for example, Nancy Fraser, Wendy Brown, Isabel Lorais. So if you're interested in that, you can just Google Emancipation in Berlin and you will find the conference and the program. And yes, now I'm very pleased to introduce Mirjam Müller with her talk, Women Are Just Better at This Stuff, the Exploitation of Emotional Labour. She is the doctoral researcher here at the Department of Philosophy and at IRI thesis. How do you say it? No one knows? Okay, then I'm glad I'm not alone in that. And in the research group Global Challenges in Economic and Environmental Ethics. Her current focus is on exploitation in global relations of production, power relations, and feminist thought. Welcome, and thank you for being here.
Okay, well, thank you, Feli, and thank you very much to the organizers for bringing about this really great initiative and very necessary one. I'm very honored to be here and be part of this very great lineup of speakers, and I'm very much looking forward to sharing some of my ideas with you. All of you have handouts and you can all hear me? Yeah, okay. Okay, so the aim of this talk today is to develop an account of gender-specific exploitation, and just to get this kind of off the ground, what I'm interested in here, I just give you a little example. So imagine a heterosexual couple, Tim and Lisa, and if there are any Tims and Lisas around, you can abstract from the names if you want. So imagine that Tim and Lisa are in a heterosexual relationship. Tim is very much socialized as a man, has learned that he is not supposed to show feelings or to care a lot about them. Lisa, on the other hand, has learned that she is very much in charge of being emotionally available, caring about other people's feelings, etc. And consequently, as a result of this, when it comes to talking about feelings in the relationship or taking up the relationship work, it's always Lisa who initiates the talk, and it's Lisa who provides the space to make sure that Tim feels comfortable talking about his feelings. Now, Tim benefits from this. The relationship gets better as a result, the relationship gets more intense, conflicts get resolved, and he also benefits on a personal level because it's very therapeutic talking about his own feelings, and it's nice to be cared for, but he doesn't really feel that it's his job to kind of do the emotional labor. Lisa is annoyed at the lack of reciprocity, but also feels that this is something that is necessary for the relationship to work, and so continues to provide the emotional labor. And so I hope during my talk to make plausible that this is a case of gender-specific exploitation, and I'll flesh that out as I go. I want to separate that claim from another claim or from another form of exploitation that concerns women. So what I'm not interested in here is women's economic exploitation. So women might experience exploitation in virtue of being female workers. So for instance, a woman might get paid less due to her gender-specific position within hierarchical gender relations. But this is not exactly what I'm interested in here. What I'm interested in is something that goes beyond that, namely where the exploitation happens not only due to the fact that women are positioned in a specific way in hierarchical gender relations, but also the way in which the advantage taking takes place. And I hope that will become clear during the talk. The motivation for that is that if I look, so I'm working on exploitation and looking at exploitation accounts, it seems to me that a lot of the dominant accounts, or most of the dominant accounts, don't really have a specific, or can't really make sense of gender-specific forms of exploitation. And I think it's actually quite necessary to grasp specifically the cases that I was talking about. And the reason for why I think that we need a gender-specific account of exploitation, well, there are two reasons in fact. The first is that I think it gives us a good instrument to understand how gender relations are sustained and reproduced, on the one hand, and it also, given that the context of the concept of exploitation is actually peculiar insofar as it makes sense of, or as can depict a specific wrong in situations where the transaction is voluntary and mutually beneficial, and yet something goes wrong. And this is actually something where it gives us a good instrument to analyze something like intimate relationships, where it seems, at least arguably, people enter into it voluntarily and benefit from doing so. Okay, so the structure of my talk will be as follows. I'll start by saying why I think the dominant account of exploitation don't really capture this form of exploitation. Then I move on to talk about the example of emotional labor with which I will illustrate the conception of gender-specific exploitation that I will motivate later. Then I draw kind of theoretical insights from that discussion of emotional labor, and in the end then provide a positive account of what I think gender-specific exploitation is. Okay, so why can't dominant account of exploitation not capture gender-specific forms of exploitation? So first of all, what are dominant accounts of exploitation? So the concept of exploitation is notoriously difficult to grasp, and people have very different opinions of what it actually is that they're talking about when they're talking about exploitation. But so the core of it seems to be something like someone takes unfair advantage of another. So some party gets more and another party gets less than they ought to get, according to some form of fairness-based baseline. So this is the kind of the core intuition of exploitation. And for the kind of purpose of this talk, I'll separate accounts of exploitation into roughly two groups. And there's a bit of a simplified separation, but I think it will kind of help to bring out why it is that they can't really capture gender-specific forms of exploitation. So on the one hand, we have transactional accounts of exploitation, and on the other hand, we have structural accounts of exploitation. And it's a bit of a continuum, so they're not completely separate. But transactional accounts of exploitation focus primarily in determining what makes a transaction exploitative. They focus primarily on the terms of the transaction itself. So what they're interested in really is there something going on wrong in the transaction between, for instance, workers and employers? So for instance, one thing that could go wrong is if workers are forced to enter a contract. If there's a forced extraction of labor, that could be captured by transactional accounts of exploitation. But they tend to abstract from the structural background conditions against which the transaction occurs. So it doesn't normally matter for the analysis whether the person is in some way structurally disadvantaged, what gender she has, whether she is a capitalist or a worker. So all these things, well, no, actually that matters. But they abstract from a lot of background conditions that are not part of the analysis. Now, structural accounts on the other end of the spectrum do focus on specifically these structural background conditions, and they tend to see exploitation as a relationship between two structurally situated groups. And so just to give you, I guess, one of the paradigm examples of structural exploitation are Marxist accounts of exploitation. So I give you a very simplified, very kind of boiled down version of what I take Marxist accounts of exploitation to be, but in a capitalist system, workers, by definition, lack access to the means of production. And that means they have to sell their labor power to sustain themselves, and they have to sell their labor power to capitalists who, in virtue of being capitalists, own the means of production. And that gives the latter, the capitalists, the power to extract surplus value from the workers. And so, I mean, this is a very simplified version. It's not really, the crucial point here really is that exploitation here kind of depicts a relationship that is structurally embedded in the background structure of a capitalist society. So structural accounts are after kind of the positions within which two parties encounter each other, and that then lead to the extraction of surplus value. Okay, so why is it that these accounts can't really capture gender-specific exploitation? I think there are in particular two reasons. So one is that they're insensitive to the gender-specific structures, and the second is that they focus on almost exclusively on commodity exploitation. Okay, so first the focus or the insensitivity to the structural aspect that gender introduces. So if we go back to transactional accounts, it seems that because they deliberately abstract from the structural background conditions, they can't really say anything about the way in which the often informal processes that gender introduce come into the picture. Just to give you an example. So say it's often not the case that women are forced to providing care work, etc. But actually it works much more informally through the internalization of certain norms, through the sanctioning of deviation from certain roles. And these are things that simply get lost on the transactional picture. So they can't really capture that. Now, we would hope that structural accounts, on the other hand, are much more able to kind of capture the gender-specific aspects of gender-specific exploitation. But here it seems that they often tend to focus on the class structures. So what they focus on is what are the kind of economic background structures that bring people into situations where they are exploited. And there's a very well-established Marxist feminist critique that comes in that has kind of challenged the distinction between, on the one hand, women's unproductive labor and men's productive labor, which can be exploited. Women's unproductive labor being the kind of reproductive labor they do or they perform in the household and in creating the workers that then get exploited by capital. And so the claim was, well, actually, this form of looking at the division between productive and unproductive labor overlooks how women's reproductive labor is also exploited by capital. But what I want to do here is, as I said in the beginning, I want to push beyond that, because I think one solution to that could be to say simply, well, in that case, we should just bring all the kind of goods into the market, actually, and thereby kind of have an account of exploitation that still focuses on commodities, but that will, in fact, then kind of also focus on the commodity that's reproductive labor. Okay, so actually that already brings me to the second problem, namely the focus on commodity exploitation, and I've kind of gone a bit too quick in the first point. So just to come back to that, the second problem with accounts of exploitation, or dominant accounts of exploitation as I characterize them, is that they tend to focus on commodity exploitation, namely exploitation that's mainly focused on goods that are in principle quantifiable and to which some sort of price can be attached. And that has the result, as I just said, that certain exchanges are overlooked, such as the exchange of reproductive labor of women. But I think the problem here again is that it doesn't seem to be, the solution to that isn't that we should just bring certain forms of labor into the market. So something like that has been suggested by Marxist feminists in the struggle for household debate, where the suggestion was, well, you know what, we should just simply put a price on certain goods that women provide, and then actually we can also make sense of that exploitation with the instruments of exploitation that we have. And more recently, although I think that was more of a kind of joke suggestion, but there's been a kind of debate going on about how women should put prices on the emotional labor they provide. But what I really want to kind of get at is, well, actually, we could also just modify the account of exploitation in a way that can then capture the non-commodified exploitation, or the exploitation of non-commodified goods. And I'll say a bit more about that in the next section. Okay, so I will now turn to illustrate what I have in mind with the example of emotional labor. So emotional labor, the term has been coined by American sociologist Ali Hochschild, and she gives the following definition that is also on your handout. Emotional labor requires us to induce or suppress feeling in order to sustain the outer continence that produces the proper state of mind in others. This kind of labor calls for coordination of mind and feeling, and it sometimes draws on a source of self that we honor as deep and integral to our individuality. So the core of this really is that emotional labor is done for the benefit of others, and it involves some sort of coordination of emotion and feeling and bodily expression to bring about a certain state of feeling in the person that we interact with. So Hochschild focuses in her analysis mainly on the exploitation of emotional labor that happens in the marketplace. And she actually also has different words for emotional labor happening in the marketplace and what she calls emotional work that's happening in the private sphere. But just for reasons of simplicity, and also because many other feminists also use the term emotional labor to cover both, I'll stick to emotional labor in my talk. But what I want to focus on here in this talk is mainly the kind of emotional labor that's happening in intimate relationships, such as friendships, romantic relationships, and family relationships. Not because I don't think that there can't also be exploitation of emotional labor going on in the marketplace, but mainly because I think that gender-specific forms of exploitation come out more clearly in these cases. Okay, so what the examples that I have in mind here involve listening to others' worries, creating space, as I said in the opening example, creating space for the other person to talk about their feelings, and also kind of keeping in mind whose birthday it is when and whom to call when, and to kind of essentially structure the whole social agenda of the relationship. So these are the things that I have in mind here. So importantly, these tasks are not necessarily unpleasant or unrewarding. So it's not like this is a necessary condition for them to be exploited. And they might actually be deeply pleasant for the people who perform them. But what's important, and this is the crucial point I want to get at, is they are necessary for the relationship, or at least the relationships I depicted, to work, and someone has to perform them. So that's the claim I go with. Okay, so what makes emotional labor specific to gender? So there are two reasons in particular. So one is that emotional labor is very clearly distributed along the lines of gender, and due to the kind of specific gender hierarchies within which we live, it's valued in certain ways. Okay, so the first point is that women disproportionately take up emotional labor. And this unequal expenditure of emotional labor is to do with women's structural position within hierarchical gender relations. And the assumption simply is that women are just, as I said in the title of my talk, women are just better at this stuff. They just do it out of their natural way of being. That's just the way we are, and here we go. And the second point, though, is that because it's happening in a specific hierarchical gender relations, because it's happening in specific hierarchical gender relations, it's also not adequately valued. So the idea here is very much this thing where the idea here is very much that if caring is its own reward, so if it's internally rewarding, then it doesn't really need kind of an external reward, or it doesn't really need to be compensated in specific ways. Okay, so just to kind of wrap up, there are 2 points. Women are structurally placed to expand emotional labor, and they're not or not adequately valued if they do so. And that creates an unequal transfer of emotional labor from women to men. So what are the benefits coming out of emotional labor? So there are, I think, particularly 3 benefits, but there might be more. But the 3 benefits I take to be most important are the following. First, there's a time benefit. So for instance, we think about, I think a good example is perhaps academia, where female professors or female staff are much more often approached by both students and their male colleagues with personal problems, personal insecurities not directly related to kind of the academic contents than their male colleagues, which means, as a consequence, that their male colleagues have much more time to kind of work on their own projects, promote their careers, etc. So there's a time benefit here. Second is there's some sort of emotional service. Being cared for, being listened to, being supported in one's projects creates a feeling of well-being and ease in the recipients of emotional labor, and that's often unreciprocated. And third, I think there's also a status benefit. Given attention to and caring about the other person's projects entails an information of importance importance, and that's often kind of not reciprocated in a sense that women then often end up kind of enhancing the status of their male colleagues or friends or whoever it is at the expense of their own. Okay, in sum, there are 2 aspects. Emotional labor is seen as women's labor due to the structural positions within hierarchical gender relations, and it creates some form of unequal benefit. So maybe just to give you so move on to the next section now, and to give you some kind of theoretical grounding of these ideas I just mentioned. Okay, so I think there are 2 features in particular that make the exchange of emotional labor specific to gender. One is, as I just kind of started to hint at, the structural background conditions against which the exchange occurs. And the structural background conditions are structurally embedded gender roles that make women vulnerable to disproportionately expanding emotional labor and to not being adequately valued for it. So the underlying idea here really is that gender positions women in certain ways, ascribes certain social positions within a given structure, and that given that that structure is patriarchy, these roles are hierarchical, such that women are subordinate to, or there's a power relation between women and men within hierarchical structures. Now, of course, importantly, gender isn't the only factor that matters here, and depending on how other factors intersect with gender, race, class, ability, sex, or age, you have women are differently positioned vis-a-vis men, and gender positions them in different ways. But the important thing that I want to get at is that in many cases women are positioned as caregivers, and that if they are so positioned, that comes with certain norms of femininity that need to be fulfilled. Namely in particular that women are more emotionally available, more caring, more altruistic, and you name it. Now, deviation from these ascribed roles still bears costs. So women who don't act emotionally available or who are not as nice as others risk being called out for it to a much higher degree than men are. So I think the kind of classic example for me is often this being kind of called out by random men at the street for not smiling enough or something like that. But there seems to be like a lot of sanctioning going on for when women are not emotionally as available as they're supposed to be. But there are also material constraints. So it's not just the kind of internalization of certain norms and the kind of acting upon on these norms by external actors, but also material constraints insofar as the way in which we, for instance, organize our caregiving in society, or the way in which the gender pay gap still constrains women in kind of taking up different jobs. So they're both kind of, it works both at the level of norms and it works at the level of material constraints, and probably those two intersect. Now that means, though, that women then optimize within their ascribed positions as caretakers by expanding disproportionate amounts of emotional labor. Bear in mind that kind of deviation from these roles still bears costs for women. Okay. Now, given, though, that under patriarchy gender relations are hierarchical, this means that not only do they expand more emotional labor, they're also kind of valued, or the value attached to that position is also lower than the value attached to positions that men tend to fulfill and carry out. Okay, so this leads me to a first desideratum for an account of gender-specific exploitation, namely that an account of gender-specific exploitation needs to be sensitive to the way in which the structurally embedded gender roles bring women in a position where they become vulnerable to expanding more emotional labor. Okay, the second feature that makes emotional labor specific to gender is the kind of specific nature of emotional labor. So, in general, an analysis of exploitation needs to give some account of the good that is exploited in the transfer. Now, the value of emotional labor, it seems, is not generally, or most accounts of exploitation, as I said, do this by attaching some sort of market value. So, if I get a certain salary, I might be exploited because that salary in some ways deviates from some fairness standard that is spelled out in market terms. Right? But things are more complicated with regards to emotional labor. Because here it seems that the value attached to emotional labor is not generally or not best captured in regard with kind of in market terms. And this is again not to say that it cannot also be, and that not certain forms of emotional labor cannot also be commodified, but that the forms of emotional labor that I'm interested in here, that happen specifically in friendships, intimate relationships, etc., it would probably profoundly change the nature of the relationship were there to be commodified. Okay, but then the question is, of course, if we cannot kind of make sense of the value of emotional labor through market, through bringing them in the market, then how can we actually understand the value of emotional labor? So which norms govern the way in which we realize the value of emotional labor? And Elizabeth Anderson has argued that we can capture, or I'm capable of valuing something in a particular way only in a social setting that holds norms for that mode of valuation. So what that means is really to say that we can only adequately express the value of something if we have the kind of social means to do so, and for that we need to analyze the social relations within which we stand towards that object, and the kind of mode of valuation that's existent in society more generally. So what is the specific, so one example for a specific relation within which we stand towards the object could be, for instance, a friendship relation versus a market relation. That will determine the way in which we value the good. Okay, an example for the kind of practice of valuing that might be context dependent is, for instance, this knocking on wood for after lecture that happens in Germany, or seminars, to kind of show appreciation, or to just, I don't know, perhaps just to wanting the seminar to end, where this is meant to show that you, whatever it's meant to show, but it's somehow meant to show something, and whereas, okay, that's not helpful. Okay, this is, let's say it's meant to show some sort of appreciation, where if you use that mode of appreciation in other contexts, at least to my knowledge, in other academic contexts, for instance, it wouldn't necessarily be understood as a form of appreciation. There you'd clap your hands, or you'd have to do something else. So the way in which you express your valuation will depend on the context within which you value it. Okay, so then what is the social relation within which we stand to emotional labour, and what is the kind of general practice according to which emotional labour is valued? And to answer these questions, I really think we need to go back to kind of looking at the way in which gender comes in when we think about emotional labour. So as I said, tasks that involve caring and loving tend to be naturalised as something inherently female, which does not require any energy or particular skill, and actually tend to be naturalized as something that doesn't really appear as labor in the first place. And interestingly and importantly, though, the meaning of emotional labor seems to change when men perform it. So it's very often the case that when men perform emotional labor, it seems to be something that's supererogatory to them, or that they receive much more praise and admiration for, simply because it's not expected that they perform it, compared to where it's normal that women should perform it. And so, in that sense, gender, the relation that we have to emotional labour is determined by gender, and that determines the way in which we relate to emotional labour. Okay, so this has important implications for the way in which it is valued. As I said, if women perform it, it tends to be naturalised as something that's not labour, and as a result also not valued properly. But it's not just that it's not valued enough, that emotional labour doesn't get enough value but it's also the kind of general practice of valuation seems to lack the tools to adequately value it. And this goes back to the idea that given that we live in certain structured conditions, dominant groups will also determine kind of the way in which the practice of valuation takes place. And so if there are no tools to kind of adequately value the emotional labour, then it will be very hard to find ways in which the value of emotional labour can be expressed properly. So hierarchical gender relations determine both, first, which value should be ascribed, and second, how that value is ascribed. Okay. So this leads me to a second desiderandum, namely that a gender-specific kind of exploitation needs to take into account the specific nature of emotional labour to adequately make sense of gender-specific forms of exploitation. Okay, so just to kind of a quick recap before I move on to the positive account of exploitation. So I outlined two desiderata. The first one, that a gender-specific account of exploitation needs to make sense of the structural background conditions against which the exchange occurs. And the second one, that's the one that I just outlined now, is that it needs to take into account the specific nature of emotional labour. So I'll now turn to a positive proposal of an account of exploitation that can capture gender-specific forms of exploitation. Okay, so to fulfill the first desideratum, I think an account of exploitation needs to integrate the specific power relations that that are installed that are installed through gender. And the question is really, how does the structurally embedded vulnerability of women allow men to extract more emotional labour from women? And Nicholas Rosales has offered an account of exploitation that tries to integrate a power analysis between two structurally positioned groups, but this account is mainly focused on economic exploitation, but I'll slightly modify that because I think it gives a good starting point to think about these things. And you also find that definition on the handout. So accordingly, A exploits B if and only if A has power over B in virtue of her position within a system of hierarchical gender relations. And second, A takes advantage of her power over B in a gender-specific way to gain a benefit. So the first condition, I think, captures the structural vulnerability aspect that I outlined in the section on kind of the way in which gender introduces structural power relation. It kind of helps us to spell out how A holds power over B and how A can, in virtue of her position of power, extract or treat B, as of now, treat B in a certain way. And now, of course, we also need to know, apart from that specific power relation that's outlined, we also need to know, so when is it that an act of advantage taking actually turns into an act of exploitation? Because it doesn't seem to be any act of advantage taking that becomes an act of exploitation. So we have a power relation in place, and then we need to think about, so how do I interact within that power relation to kind of turn that into exploitation? And this is really the aspect where, for me, the gender-specific exploitation comes in. And this is also where the second kind of criterion comes in, namely the specific nature of the good of emotional labour. So the gender-specific nature of the good of emotional labour, as I argued, required a specific type of valuation. And we now need to know, kind of to determine when a transaction is exploitative, we need to determine when the expenditure of emotional labour is under or misvalued in a way that turns into action, into an act of exploitation. Now, of course, this piggybacks to some extent on the question of what the right type of valuation is to kind of capture the specific social relations related to emotional labour, and that goes to some extent beyond what I'm trying to do here. I think Elizabeth Anderson has it would be a good starting point to work with her theory of value pluralism, where she really tries to kind of work out different modes of valuation given different social relations. But what I'm going to do here is really kind of to just give you a more general structure of the argument, and then this theory would have to be plugged in later. Okay, I believe that A fails to value the good of emotional labour adequately in two instances. One, A does not use the appropriate mode of valuation, and then again here you need to kind of plug in theory of appropriate valuation. Or second, A does not use any or insufficient valuation due to the naturalization of B's contribution. So this then kind of really fleshes out the second condition, namely the advantage-taking part. So A takes advantage in a way that constitutes gender-specific exploitation when these two conditions are fulfilled. And that leaves us with two necessary and jointly sufficient conditions for an account of exploitation. So A has power over B in virtue of A's social position within a system of hierarchical gender relations. This is the first necessary condition for exploitation. A takes advantage of her power over B in a gender-specific way to gain a benefit, where taking advantage in a gender-specific way is understood as either not using the appropriate mode of valuation or not using any or insufficient valuation due to the naturalization of B's contribution. This is where the kind of second condition gets plugged in. Okay, so this is kind of the account of exploitation, gender-specific exploitation that I want to defend. The question is now, so what are the implications for having such an account in the first place? And as I said in the beginning, one of the implications is that it can make sense of the way in which hierarchical gender relations are sustained and reproduced. Because in spending disproportionate amounts of labour, a couple of things happen. Women not only confirm their social position as caregivers, but they also forgo other options, as I outlined in the kind of time benefit, for instance, and thereby also create some sort of path dependency where once you socialize into some sort of behavior, you become good at it in some ways, and it's expected from you, and it kind of creates some sort of self-fulfilling circle. But it also, at the same time, benefits the benefits of emotional labour, sustain the power that men are able to enjoy in virtue of their social position within hierarchical gender relations. So they can use their time differently, have their status confirmed, and their well-being taken care of disproportionately. So what are the specific measures for overcoming gender-specific exploitation? So given that, as I said, gender-specific exploitation really is embedded in the kind of structural conditions of patriarchy, what we need to do is not direct kind of the measures at individual wrongdoing, but really at some form of structural change. I have in mind Iris Marion Young's account of responsibility for structural change. So the idea here is really, well, actions need to be directed. We need collective action that are directed at the norms and expectations and values underlying certain institutions and certain practices. So, something like consciousness-raising campaigns, working with others to kind of change certain norms around emotional labour, but will also require material changes. on a kind of very micro level, it might require, how can we organize space differently such that there's not only one partner who's responsible for kind of creating the space that emotional labor, or that the kind of the relationship is sustained? How can we organize childcare practices differently? I mean, this is on a more macro level now, or care for the elderly. In general, kind of how can care work on a policy level be organized differently such that it's not kind of the primary responsibility of one gender. Okay, in short, ending gender-specific exploitation really requires changing the underlying structures or the underlying structurally embedded gender roles. So just to sum up, I started this talk with the statement that women are just better at this stuff. And I hope that I've made plausible why, first of all, why the statement is so problematic and how it kind of helps to cover up certain ways in which emotional labor is disproportionately extracted, and how that serves to kind of sustain specific hierarchical gender relations. Thank you.